Right, hi everybody, welcome back. Let's move on to topic 5.2 today. Topic 5.2 is called Terrestrial Food Production Systems and Food Choices. It's one of those topics again where I think the IB have just thrown a load of ideas into this subtopic and they don't kind of gel together that well. I didn't want to put this into one video because there's so many of these ideas, so I wanted to split it into two. But it doesn't work very well in terms of there being a very obvious split between those two topics. So nominally, what I'm going to do is, in this video, I'll talk about terrestrial food production systems themselves, what they are. And in the second video, I'm going to focus more on food choices. However, there's an awful lot of overlap between those two topics. So it's not an easy thing to split into two subtopics. I'll do my best. So before we look at the syllabus, I'll just go through the main definitions. You can see them above my head. First of all, commercial food production is food that's produced for profit or food that's produced directly for sale. Subsistence food production is the opposite. It's a food production system in which you produce food to feed yourself and your family. Obviously, commercial food production is more prevalent in MEDCs, whereas subsistence food production is more prevalent in LEDCs. Intensive food production is a food production system where you have large inputs in terms of water, chemical fertilizer, everything else, in order to produce high outputs. Outputs in agriculture we refer to as yield. So yield is food production per unit area of land. It's high for intensive food production, and then it's low for extensive food production systems. Extensive food production systems are generally agriculture with low inputs leading to low yields. And again, obviously, intensive food production systems we associate with MEDCs and extensive food production systems with LEDCs. Now, there's a little bit of a paradox here because in many MEDCs, there's very little available in terms of exports other than food crops. So therefore, many LEDCs are dependent on exporting foods, but at the same time, they don't have access to the intensive agricultural systems that we have in MEDCs. Also, MEDCs are more protective about the importing food from other countries and protecting their own agricultural systems at home. Okay, so that's basically the definitions. Let's take a look at the syllabus. Now, as I said, it's a bit of a hodgepodge. They've thrown a lot of ideas into this part of the syllabus, so it might take a while to get through all of these things. This first part, we have to consider sustainability, and we're asked to do it in terms of these different ideas. Influences such as scale, the amount of industrialization, mechanization, use of fossil fuels, choices of seed and crops and livestock, use of water, use of fertilizer, use of pest control products, by that they mean herbicides and insecticides, effects on pollinators, use of antibiotics, which are drugs used to control bacterial diseases, generally in livestock, the application of legislation by different governments, and the levels of commercial versus subsistence farming in different places. So that's an awful lot to consider. Basically, what it's asking us to do is consider the sustainability of intensive farming, because all of these things that I mentioned here really are associated with intensive farming. And we'll probably see that intensive farming becomes less and less sustainable in comparison with extensive food production. But then at the same time, as it says in the second point, human population is still growing, urbanization is still increasing, and we are becoming more and more dependent on intensive agriculture. And then finally, just another one of those topics that doesn't kind of link to the rest of it. The yield or the output of food per trophic level is lower, is lower for higher trophic levels. So if we take food from higher trophic levels, we need to put more inputs in to be able to grow that 1 kilogram of foodstuff. So therefore, it's more sustainable to take food from lower trophic levels. I hope I explained that okay. I'll come back to that in later parts of this video. In terms of applications in this one, the IB just says we need to be able to analyse tables and graphs that illustrate differences in inputs and outputs associated with these food production systems. In other words, we need to be able to apply these ideas to systems diagrams. Again, I think that's something for the classroom rather than something I'll go through in this particular video. Okay, so putting this together, as an introduction, I just put a few ideas on this slide about food production systems in general. So first of all, about 1/6 of the entire human population is currently undernourished. That equates to about 1 billion people. And obviously, the majority of those people live in LEDCs. So there's a lack of equity of food availability around the world. Conversely, in MEDCs, we have a problem of obesity and huge wastage of food resources. We've mentioned this already. In LEDCs, food production is generally subsistence. In MEDCs, it's commercial. In LEDCs, it's generally extensive farming methods, whereas in MEDCs, it's intensive agriculture. Another thing I've already mentioned, MEDCs try to protect their own food industries through import tariffs and export subsidies. And what that does in turn, it makes those LEDCs that I mentioned before that are dependent on food exports, it makes it very, very difficult for them to switch to other products or to switch from subsistence farming to intensive agriculture. Very often LEDCs have very little to export other than food crops. And as you can see from that, there is an imbalance in food supply globally. In terms of food prices, I guess these graphs are not that visible, but I think you can see the pattern. The top graph basically shows you the price of food over the last 15 years or so. Well, up to about 2015 anyway. And you can see that the price of food is volatile. The blue line here, if you can just about see it, is the World Food Price Index. And then the other colours are for different foods. The green line is for fats and oils. The red line is grain products. And the purple line is other foods. But you can see that they generally follow the same kind of pattern. They've been increasing over time, over the last 15 to 20 years. And they're volatile. There's peaks and troughs in that graph. This bottom graph explains those peaks and troughs. The blue line is the World Price Index. The red line is the price of oil, world price of oil. And you can see that the price of food is very obviously linked to the price of oil. That's in terms of fuels or fossil fuel used for energy to grow the food, but also to transport and refrigerate that food as well. So as you can see here, world food prices have generally been increasing, although they're volatile. Part of that is due to increasing reliance on meat-rich diets. As LEDCs switch to becoming newly industrialized countries or NICs, people become more dependent on meat-rich diets. More and more foods are being grown not for human consumption, but for consumption by animals for their meat. And more farmland is being used not to grow crops necessarily, but to grow biofuels. Land is becoming more expensive and more limited. I think we've mentioned before that the two biggest growers and exporters of biofuels are the US and Brazil. And a big problem in Brazil is the availability of land or the use of land for agriculture and use for growing biofuels is cutting into the rainforest and leading to deforestation. World oil prices are unstable, and therefore transportation and refrigeration costs are also increasing. So the costs of our food are increasing and are volatile at the same time. Okay, returning to something I mentioned in the syllabus, the the inputs that you need to put in to grow a kilogram of food are dependent on which trophic level you take them from. If you take food from the lowest trophic levels, like corn, cereals, you need less inputs. If you take food from higher trophic levels, for example, sheep and cows, you require more input of energy, more input of materials in order to grow that kilogram of food. In terms of comparing terrestrial agriculture to aquatic agriculture, we generally take fish from higher trophic levels than we do from terrestrial meat products. So, for example, salmon is from the 4th trophic level, tuna is from the 5th trophic level, cows and sheep are at the 2nd trophic level. So, 1 kilogram of farm salmon requires much greater input of energy and materials than 1 kilogram of terrestrial meat, for example, beef. However, it's worth remembering that a lot of aquatic systems are natural fisheries where we're not actually inputting that energy and material in the first place. We're just scooping those products out of nature. Okay, and then finally, that first point in the syllabus made all of these, or asked us to look at all of these things. So I'll try and go through them one by one. It asks us to consider, and we'll do this in the classroom, consider those things in terms of the sustainability of the agricultural system. So obviously these things more or less refer all of them to intensive farming in MEDCs. So we could argue that the food production system in MEDCs is much less sustainable than extensive farming in LEDCs. But let's look at some details about it. So first of all, industrialization. Industrialization is inputted into agriculture as a means to maximize profits. Obviously, it's associated with the intensive farming, generally at the expense of workers and workers' rights. A lot of MEDCs are becoming more and more dependent on migrant labour. It's linked to mechanization. Mechanization is increased dependency on machines like tractors, combine harvesters, milking machines. Machines can work at a faster rate than humans, obviously, and can work throughout the day and throughout the night. So that puts people's working rights and people's jobs at risk in agriculture. Again, associated with intensive farming, and again associated with the MEDCs. These machines are not generally available in LEDCs to the extent they are in MEDCs for intensive agriculture. Fossil fuel use, much greater in MEDCs, used for transportation, refrigeration, and the energy used to grow the crops in the first place. As I said before, LEDCs are becoming, in some cases, very dependent on agricultural exports. And people in MEDCs, although I want to talk about food choices in the second video, people in MEDCs want greater availability of food all year round and are less likely to accept the seasonality of some foodstuffs. I read an article recently that I should have fact-checked, but I think this is correct. When you sit down for your Christmas dinner with your family, the food that you put on your table, on average, will have travelled about 37,000 food kilometres, which is incredible. We just expect food to be available in our supermarkets, and we expect it to be available from all parts of the world. That transportation and that availability of foods requires huge amounts of fossil fuels for transportation and for refrigeration, both during transport and in your supermarket. Seed, crop and livestock choices. People in LEDCs have a diet generally based on cereals. In MEDCs we have a much more mixed diet, but much more meat-rich. But in LEDCs there is increasing consumption of meat, especially as they turn from true LEDCs to newly industrialized countries. I'm thinking there especially of people in China. Globally, for example, chicken consumption from the 1990s onwards increased by about 70%. And a lot of that is driven by increasing reliance on meat diets in China. Also in MEDCs, again, this is perhaps moving into the territory of the second video, we're able to make much more choices about what foods we eat in terms of whether it's organic, free range, and we can choose to be vegetarian or vegan perhaps. Those are choices that are not available to the average person in LEDCs. Okay, next one is water use. Incredibly, about 70% of all the water we use globally is used for agriculture. And that's still increasing because, as we said before, global population is still increasing and demand for foods is still increasing. As LEDCs again transition into NICs, they become more dependent on foods that require more water use, especially meats. And a meat-rich diet requires huge amounts of water use. So let me give you an example. Again, these are average figures I just looked up in the textbook. 1 kilogram of wheat requires about 1,300 litres of water to produce it. Now that might sound like a huge amount of water, but wait till I tell you what 1 kilogram of meat requires. 1 kilogram of maize, about the same, perhaps a little less, about 900 litres of water. However, 1 kilogram of chicken needs about 4,000 litres of water to produce that 1 kilogram. And 1 kilogram of beef, on average, 15,000 litres of water. That's 15 tonnes of water to produce that 1 kilogram of beef that you buy in the supermarket, which is incredible amount of water, and not sustainable. Remember again, the idea of this section is to, in the classroom, we'll consider the sustainability of applying all of these things to food production systems. Fertilizers. Obviously, MEDCs use much more fertilizer, especially artificial fertilizers. The problems of nitrogen-rich fertilizers we've discussed in other parts of the course. For one thing, nitrogen fertilizers release nitrogen oxides, which are greenhouse gases, and they're leached into groundwater and surface waters and can therefore lead to eutrophication problems. Again, we've looked at that in different parts of the course before. Pesticides. The use of pesticides is increasing globally. Usually we talk about pesticides in terms of insecticides to control insects and herbicides to control weeds. If we go all the way back to topic 2, you might remember that we talked about the bioaccumulation and the biomagnification of pesticides. So they affect the higher trophic levels disproportionately, and that can include humans. There's been big problems with pesticide use around the world. One problem is poisoning of agricultural workers and people using them. One of the most famous cases was a pesticide called Roundup, which was a herbicide. Currently, it's still going through the courts, I think. But if I look at if I look at the figures that I collected just before coming on to this video, the biggest herbicide used globally is glyphosate, or it's called Roundup. And it was a herbicide originally produced by Monsanto and then sold to Bayer Industries. In June 2020, Bayer paid about $9.6 billion to try to settle cases that have been brought from people that felt that the cancers had been caused by using this pesticide. At the moment, as I record this, it's still going through the courts, and Bayer claimed that the link between cancer and the use of that pesticide is not well established, but those cases are currently being settled. So there is a problem of pesticide use. Antibiotics. Well, antibiotics, as I said before, are drugs that are used to control bacterial diseases. They're used in intensive agriculture and aquaculture, as a matter of fact, to control density-dependent diseases in the animals that are being farmed. which means you can cram more and more animals into smaller and smaller spaces and use these drugs to try to keep them healthy. They're also used to increase yield, to keep meat on the animals at a high level. And incredibly, 80% of all the antibiotics that are sold worldwide are actually used for farming animals, not for human use. We've already spoke about use of antibiotics in fish farming and the problems that caused. And they're also used, as I said, to fatten animals rather than just to control disease. There's two big issues with the use of antibiotics. One is that perhaps these antibiotics can pass into humans, although the scientific evidence is still being collected with regard to that, and whether it's dangerous. And the other is the idea that overuse of antibiotics in farming could lead to the development of resistant strains of bacteria that can be very, very harmful. Around the world over recent years, the outbreaks of salmonella especially have really started to increase. And some scientists are putting that down to these resistant strains of bacteria being produced by overuse of antibiotics in farming. Okay, last couple. Pollinators. These are animals, generally insects, that pollinate plants, and they do that for free. But the use of insecticides especially seems to be having an effect on insect populations or pollinating insect populations, specifically bees, on a global scale. Insecticides are generally fairly indiscriminate, and they can kill plague insects as well as useful pollinators. Bee population around the world have crashed since the year 2000. Bees pollinate about 1/3 of all the crops we grow for human consumption, but scientifically there's still some dispute about whether this crash in bee population is really caused by insecticides. The largest insecticide that's used worldwide are neonicotinoids, which are, I'll put that right, which are chemicals based on the molecule nicotine. There's been bans by a lot of governments around the world of these pesticides because they seem to be able to have an effect on bee population, but that's disputed by the manufacturers of those products. Interestingly, in the US they were banned, and Donald Trump's administration reversed that ban on the use of those pesticides, insecticides. And then finally, legislation. We can talk again a bit more about this in the class. I'm aware that I'm rambling on as usual. A lot of governments around the world try to legislate to control their farming industry in terms of production and in terms of safety, both for agricultural workers and for consumers. And probably the best example is the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union. So this is legislation where in the European Union the idea was to increase productivity, ensure a fair price for farmers, and to try to keep food markets stable. In other words, to try and lead to some level of sustainability in the agricultural industry. The big problem in the European Union over time, though, was the overproduction of a lot of foodstuffs, and this led to these so-called food mountains in Europe. And legislation is still trying to be put into place to deal with that level of overproduction. In the second video, I'll talk a bit more about food waste and the amount of that food waste. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. Again, I apologise. I don't think it's my fault, but because of the nature of the syllabus in this section, it's a bit of a scattergun approach. It's kind of all over the place. But what I want to discuss more in the classroom based on this is this idea of trying to reach sustainability in food production and the problems that all of these factors lead to in intensive agriculture specifically. The other thing that I want to go back to, especially in the second video, is to make a direct comparison of food production systems and choices in LEDCs compared to MEDCs So a lot of this stuff is relevant, and there's a lot of crossover into what I'll do in that second video. Okay, so I'll speak to you in the classroom where we'll discuss this a bit further. Right, thanks for your attention, everybody. Goodbye.